Okay, thanks very much for agreeing, for inviting me to talk to you. I'm going to cover 6 areas, but first I want to introduce myself. So as you said, I was working at Newham until fairly recently. I'm a visiting fellow at Bath University currently, and I'm going to talk about the importance of evidence for decision making. I'm going to do that, first of all, by looking at by taking a borough-wide approach. So Newham has just completed the development of a 10-year outcomes framework focusing on how we measure health, how they measure health, happiness and well. And as part of that approach, they've developed a set of strategic outcomes that need to be measured obviously at borough-wide level. So we've established a borough-wide sample survey, which is then representative at the borough level, but that enables people to track development outcomes and well-being, and particularly happiness over the next 10-year periods, linking into the GLA evidence base and also the national evidence base. So very important to have a sort of national benchmarking for the borough, but it's also equally evident that having a survey sample alone isn't going to produce that hyper-local view of what places need. So my next example is around engaging neighbourhoods in place shaping through the design and development of community assemblies. Community assemblies first developed in Newham in 1819 to improve resident participation and influencing decision making. Initially, each of the 8 neighbourhoods had a budget of £25,000 paid for through the community infrastructure levy, and that money was allocated by local people for local priorities such as clean streets, environmental cleanups, environmental improvements such as community gardens. But more recently, with the publication of the Democracy Commission report that Newham commissioned, it was obvious that actually that wasn't sufficient funding, and now the borough is participating in participatory budgeting for each of the 8 neighbourhoods having £100,000 allocated to it. Only one of the 2 councils in the country taking this approach. Each neighbourhood has 4 different assembly events with a mix of people at local level, residents and officers, plus community voluntary sector partners, and that's to set priorities, agree what priorities are through voting both online and in person, and then providing feedback. And there's a working group of residents participating in that local place shaping agenda. My next example is to understand social networks and we wanted to understand social networks in 3 particular places within the borough. So Stratford, East Ham and Royal Docks. Really interesting piece of work that interviewed over 800 residents back in 2011-12 to really identify how Newham at the time developed a community development framework for building community and economic resilience. Those 3 places, although quite similar in a geographic way, are actually very different in the network approach. So much more localized networks in East Ham, much denser, more homogeneous networks in the docks, and a much looser and much wider spread of people with network into Stratford. And that meant we needed to think about, the borough needed to think about how it designed its workplace to help people into jobs, it meant the connections, and it's just as a model there, I don't expect you to read it, but the connections really identify that the people without jobs were least likely to know people could get them into work. And the most networked people, unsurprisingly, were the employed residents. So that meant we needed to try and network, coordinate within workplace. We've also been part of the, Newham's also been part of the London Prosperity Board pilot back in 2017, where it wanted to identify the impact of the significant regeneration that the Royal Docks and Canning Town have received on existing residents just outside of the regen areas. So we wanted to understand, when residents talk about the impact of prosperity, what that means for them, and also where they see the impact of change over time. And that's now part of the longitudinal study that the London Prosperity Board are running. And that will give us an opportunity, or give Newham an opportunity to look at the longer term impacts of regen on the existing residents, and making sure that the existing residents are actually supported and developed to get skills and to develop as employment opportunities expand and grow in those areas. So that hyper local citizen science approach that UCL has been developing and has been tested in the borough is really helpful to get people to talk about their experiences of change and experiences of regeneration in really small parts of the borough. And my final example in terms of participation was how we engaged with, how Newham engaged with young people to understand the direction of travel in terms of the Youth Safety Board agenda back in 2018. Over 100 people, or young people, took part in a youth assembly led by the mayor, talking about how they feel about what they feel about safety, places such as alleyways and parks, much less safe. But young people also talked about timing for access to some of these places. So at night, unsurprisingly, much less safe than places they felt during the day. And they also talked about public transport safety leading to a significant improvement in terms of the relationship with TfL, actually, about safety and the safety agenda. But they also talked about particular kinds of behaviours that made people feel unsafe, and the need for better street lighting, investment in youth, which has now been developed. And they also needed to talk about the importance of support and places that you can go to make them feel safe. So that's all contributed to the youth safety strategy for the area. But I think the demonstration of the shift from quite a quantitative start thinking about well-being over a 10-year period to actually hyper-local work and working with particular residents in a very much a participatory engagement way has really opened the evidence base for the borough to inform its decision making. I'm going to stop there.